Hey guys, Will here. Now today we have in front of us the VNM Shifter and handbrake. Focus of today's video is going to be the shifter, and in the next video we'll be taking a detailed look at their handbrake system. So VNM are a Vietnamese brand. They've got an increasing range of various different sim racing products, from pedals and wheelbases all the way through to shifters and handbrakes. And their shifter is one of the few on the market that allows you to choose between sequential or H-Pattern shifting modes. So we're going to check it out today and find out whether this is the shifter for you. So stick around. So before we kick off today's video, big thank you to VNM as well as Trak Racer for arranging for these products to come across to us to check out today for review. Now, if you do decide you want to pick up these or any of the other products we mentioned in today's video, there are some links down in the description below. Those are an awesome way to help support the channel and our work here at Boosted Media at no additional cost to you. So thank you very much for your support there. But as always, everything that we say today is completely our own observations and opinions with no outside influence whatsoever. So the VNM Shifter is named the Shifter V1, but it's important to understand that there has been quite a lot of revision going on behind the scenes with this product since some of the reviews that you might have seen come out around about a year ago. And some of the changes that have taken place in the last year do also have quite a significant impact on the driving experience with this product. So if you have watched one of those older videos, I would recommend you stick around for this one, because we will be showing some new stuff that you might not have seen before in today's video. Now let's start off here by talking about pricing. We'll set the handbrake aside. We're going to be looking at that in the next video. So $289 US or 469 Australian dollars for the shifter. That comes with the 6+1 shifter plate. So you can see here we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 gears plus reverse, as well as the sequential shift plate, which we'll look at a little bit later on today. It comes with both of those in the box. If you do want to buy any additional plates, there's a 4+ reverse and also a 7+ reverse. They come in at $19 US or 29 Australian dollars. Now, if we compare those prices to the Fanatec Shifter, for example, that comes in at $259.95 US, so around a similar price in US dollars. Although if we're comparing Australian pricing, the Fanatec Shifter is quite a lot cheaper than this is, coming in at 349 Australian dollars as opposed to 469 Australian dollars for this guy. Now, while we're talking about the Fanatec Shifter, there are quite a few similarities in terms of the operation, the overall look and feel of this shifter. However, the most important thing to understand straight off the bat here is that, as we saw before, this utilizes a replacement top plate, which you actually have to unscrew and switch over on the top of the module, as opposed to the slider switch on the back of the Fanatec Shifter to quickly change between sequential and H-Pattern mode. So depending on how often you like to switch between H-Pattern and sequential, most likely will ultimately determine which one of these two products is going to be the better choice for you. But let's dive in now and take a look at exactly what you're getting in terms of hardware with the VNM Shifter, and then we'll dive into the driving experience. So dimensions wise, 110 millimeters wide in either direction, 135 millimeters tall to the top of the unit here, and 240 millimeters tall to the top of the knob. Obviously depending, or not obviously because you guys haven't seen it yet, but depending on the knob that you choose, because it comes with a spherical as well as a cylindrical knob, and those are adjustable in height up and down. That's one thing that you wouldn't have seen in previous review videos most likely. They now have a little ring with a piece inside like that, which cinches down when you tighten the knob. So I'll screw that back on. So it slides on like so, and then tightens in place, and you can adjust it from about there all the way down to there. Now, one observation that I did have is that the knob does tend to spin in your hands while you're using the shifter. That is the case for both of these knobs. Unfortunately, with my level of strength, I wasn't able to tighten it enough to stop that from happening. Now, the older version did utilize a grub screw in there. That has the disadvantage, of course, of grinding away at the shaft and damaging it over time. It is a stainless steel shaft, but this design does stop the scratching. May or may not bother you, but it is something that we did notice while we were driving with the shifter. So we'll set that guy aside again, chuck this guy back on, and I'm going to leave it in its bottom position for now. So entirely metal construction all the way through, and the thing just screams quality. Obviously, you saw earlier the illuminated logo there with a bunch of different RGB patterns which you can flash, as well as a few customization options too. We'll show you that when we get stuck into the software in just a minute. Replaceable top plates as you saw before, but everything that you see here externally is all metal. Aluminium around here, aluminium shift knob, and then a stainless steel shaft through the middle. Now, if we flip it around to the back here, You can see a couple of USB ports, one for connecting to the PC, one for connecting various accessories. We've got a little push button here to switch between operation mode and firmware flash or DFU mode, and then a switch here to switch between H-Pattern mode and sequential mode. So when you switch out the top plate, you also have to flick that across, and that tells the software to switch between modes. Thankfully, you don't have to unplug it, plug it back in, or do anything like that. It's detected immediately in the software as soon as you switch across modes here. Now in the back here, you'll see an assortment of M6 threads. Those are spaced 30 millimeters apart horizontally and 27 millimeters apart vertically. Now there's also mounting holes on the base, and those are a 60 millimeter square pattern. So 60 millimeters center to center, top to bottom, left to right, whichever direction. Now, Trak Racer's rigs do actually come pre-drilled now with holes specifically for this shifter as well. So if you do happen to have a more recent Trak Racer rig, this will bolt directly on, but just check their website for the full list of compatibility. Now, one thing just to be aware of when it does come to mounting this, you'll notice the screws for this bottom plate do protrude out. So if you are planning on mounting flush up against something, that may cause issues for you. You may need to put a couple of washers or some sort of spacer in between your rig and the back plate here. You also need to make sure that you're not blocking the USB port or the switch to flick between H-Pattern or sequential mode. The button to switch between flash mode and operation mode might be not quite so important because it's not something you're likely to be doing often, but you will need to make sure you leave the USB port and the selection switch free. Now, just on the subject of mounting, there are also some aluminium mounting brackets available from VNM. Unfortunately, we don't have them here to show you guys, but if you have a look at some of the other reviews on YouTube, you'll see those in lots of detail, so definitely check that out. One option they do have as well is this mounting bracket, which bolts directly onto the back of the unit. It can be oriented in either direction, and that then allows you to bolt their handbrake directly onto the back here, and that's how we ended up having it configured on my rig. And obviously, depending on whether you're driving left-hand or right-hand drive or which side you want the handbrake on, you can rotate that around to suit either way. One thing to be aware of is if you do have the handbrake mounted on the left-hand side of the shifter, this little hole here is the adjustment for the tension in the Y-axis, or how stiff the shifter is to move up and down. So if you are needing to change that adjustment regularly, you will find yourself needing to pull the handbrake off if it's mounted on this side. So just be aware of that. So that adjustment does have quite a significant impact on the overall sensation of the shifter. It's not really a good idea to talk about the feeling of the shifter or anything like that while we're sitting here on the desk without this mounted. So we'll save all of that until we've got it mounted up on the rig. So let's quickly show you now how we switch between H-Pattern and sequential mode, and then we'll take a look inside. So as I mentioned earlier, unlike with the Fanatec Shifter, which has a slider switch to choose between sequential or H-Pattern mode, there is a little bit of work involved. They do include some Allen keys inside the box, which you will need to get this job done. So we're going to grab our 3.5mm Allen key out of the kit. And first thing we're actually going to do is remove the knob. So we undo that, slide the knob straight off. And as I mentioned earlier, we can complete this task in just, well, I've done it probably 20, 30 times now. I can do it in just under 2 minutes. I'm sure there'll be people that'll be faster than me though. But what we do is you just unscrew the 4 little stainless hex bolts in the top here. Be very careful you don't drop them down inside, because that's going to be a nightmare to retrieve, particularly if you have this bolted to your rig. There we go, and then we simply just lift this entire plate out. And as I mentioned earlier, these plates are interchangeable. So they have the standard 6+1 or 6+ reverse. They have a 2+ reverse and also a 7+ reverse. So that gives you the full 4 rows, with reverse being down the bottom or up the top, depending on how you want to configure it. Now, importantly, these are keyed, so they will only fit in one way. You'll notice a rounded off edge on the bottom. So it can only install in one direction. And another thing you'll notice here at the bottom is we've got the aluminium housing, and then we've got this little piece of Delrin plastic internally here as well. And what this does is it softens the bump stop just a little bit, stops that harsh metal to metal contact, and that makes it significantly quieter in operation, which is of course going to be important if you've got somebody studying or trying to sleep nearby to where you are trying to sim race. Now, the other cool thing is that there's no mechanical parts to the H-Pattern gate. So if you do have a 3D printer, or you're good with metal, or maybe you want to make it out of wood or something like that, you can make your own different gates here. And because of the way this guy operates, you'll see this in the software a little bit later on, but you can actually calibrate any shape you want. So basically, your imagination and the physical range of movement available on the shaft are the only 2 limitations here. You can make pretty much whatever you want. So if you want to simulate some sort of a weird truck, or maybe a lawnmower, there's a lawnmower sim just coming out in a couple of weeks, I believe. You know, all those kinds of things you can do with this. So it's a very, very versatile product. Now, if we pull across the sequential plate, This is going to drop in over the top, and remember, as we said before, it is keyed. Now this is where you'll see a significant difference over some of the other reviews that you might have seen in the past. This is their V2 sequential plate. This actually comes as standard with the V1 shifter now, which I know is a little bit confusing. But what they've done here now is completely revise this design. You'll see a little metal ball bearing there down the bottom. And there's a couple of spring-loaded ball bearings here which provide the tension to return the lever back to center. So the tension when you're pushing forward is provided not only by the spring being compressed, but also the mechanism in the base, which we'll look at in a minute. But then you've also got the spring tension here trying to force it back into the center. And those are adjustable too. So you can wind in and out with the provided Allen key to tighten or loosen those two springs. Now, if you have a look through the bottom here underneath this red anodized aluminium, you'll notice a little fork assembly, and that is attached to this rocker here, which has a spring-loaded ball bearing in the top. So what happens is when you shift downwards, that fork is pulled down and it shifts that way, and vice versa when you go the other direction, of course, it moves that way. So that gives you a nice mechanical clunk and gives you the sensation of actually mechanically changing between gears, like the thing's actually connected to something mechanically inside the gearbox. And as you'll see later on in today's video, it actually does a really, really good job of that in sequential mode in particular. So what we would do to switch to sequential is simply drop this guy on. So it slides through, slides into place like so. We reinsert our 4 bolts, and then Bob's your uncle. You now have sequential mode. You may need to adjust the tension there. You'll notice at the moment it's kind of staying in that one position. If we grab our other Allen key and loosen this guy off just a touch, now, there you go. That's now slotting back into position. Now, if we have a look down inside the unit, you can see there's quite a complex mechanism going on inside here. So let's slide this out of the outer housing now and have a look at exactly how this works. Okay, so it all looks very complex in here, but it's actually pretty straightforward in how it operates when you break it down. So let's do exactly that right now. So we've got a couple of positional sensors here on an I2C circuit. So we can see we've got a 3.3 volt in, we've got an output, a ground, a serial clock, and a serial data connection. And then on the underside, we've got our PCB. That's an STM32 processor. And if we flip it around so it's the right way up, we can see VNM Simulation Shifter version 3 made in Vietnam. So this is a custom PCB which they've had designed or designed themselves for the purpose and then had it printed and populated themselves. So it's not just an off-the-shelf piece that they're using here, which is always nice to see, although there's nothing wrong with doing that. It's always cool to see something custom. So if we flip that up, you can see the mechanism underneath here. So 2 positional sensors, one measuring the x-axis and one measuring the y-axis. And between the 2 of them, it knows exactly where the mechanism sits within the bounds of this area inside here. So the way this actually works is if we flip it around on this side, we can see a spring-loaded mechanism here that provides the tension on the x-axis or from side to side. And then on the y-axis, so when we actually shift into the gears, we've got a separate mechanism on the side here, which is a spring-loaded ball bearing. And that little screw there can be tightened or loosened to adjust the tension on that ball bearing. Pretty much the same kind of idea as what we saw here with the ball bearings stipulating how much strength there is on the sequential shifter. And then there's some little notches cut out on this little metal plate here, which I believe is a piece of steel affixed to the aluminium enclosure. And then that ball bearing simply just pops into some little divots on that plate, and that is what provides the sensation of mechanical movement between them. Now at the moment you can see I've got that set quite light. If I were to wind that in, you'd see it becomes quite stiff as we move it in. But we'll talk about stiffness and adjustment later on when we go for a drive. Now this entire assembly is all made of CNC machined or billet aluminium. As you can see, nice beveled edges as well. Doesn't really matter if anything is sharp in here anyway, because it's not something you're ever going to touch, but it isn't for what it's worth. And we can see nice sealed metal ball bearing systems throughout here as well. So yeah, when you break it down, it's pretty straightforward in how it works. Spring-loaded movement here for our x-axis. We can see another little ball bearing there as well to make sure that we're not grinding on those cams as we move it from side to side. And then if we spin around on the y-axis, the whole assembly moves front and back with a little ball bearing on there to pop it into each position. So just looking through here, we've got retainer nuts on the screws, so those should never come loose. And yeah, I see absolutely no issues in terms of quality here whatsoever. So let's get this put back together and let's get into the driving and software. So let's dive in now, take a look at the software side of things with the VNM configuration tool. Now this software is responsible for calibration and adjustment for any VNM product which you purchase. And you can see across the top here, we've got a tab for wheelbase, hardware, shifter, which is where we're going to be spending our time today, obviously, pedals and handbrake, which we'll be looking at in our handbrake review in a few days' time. So as they add more products to their ecosystem, more tabs will appear in this software. So it's a nice way of combining everything together without having to have multiple software packages for every single product. Having said that, the software is a little bit on the, I guess, cluttered side. There is a lot of sort of debuggy type stuff here. You can see on the right-hand side here, we've got a whole bunch of stats. We've got a system log, which appears on the right-hand side too. So for those who want to be able to see everything, I'm sure you're not going to be disappointed here. If you do prefer a cleaner look, maybe we'll see them add a simple mode to this software later on, which removes a lot of the somewhat superfluous information, which isn't going to be relevant to a lot of people. But let's run through quickly what we do have here and what we can do. So we've got a drop-down menu here on the left-hand side, which allows us to choose between multiple devices. So obviously if you have multiple shifters on your rig, if you've got one for H-Pattern and one for Sequential, for example, you can choose which one you're going to be working on in the software from here. So it is good that they've thought of that and you're not limited to one device connected to your PC. You can see the device ID listed here on the right-hand side of that drop-down menu. And you'll notice over here on the right-hand side, we've got a system log, which shows every change and as it's flashed to the device. So the changes that we make here are actually flashed to the device, meaning that any calibration carries through across all the different sim titles that you might be driving with. So continuing down the left-hand side here, we've got a few things that we can play with. We can display trails. And if we select the shifter configuration report here, you'll see it shows a trail of exactly where the shifter moves relative to its position in the base. Now that might seem superfluous, but if you do want to create your own custom top plates here, that is something that you can do with this shifter, and this is where that kind of thing is going to start to come in handy. So we're going to switch off those trails again just for now and blank that out. On the right-hand side, we've got a drop-down menu for inversion mode. Not 100% clear on exactly what that's intended for. The manual doesn't really explain it. Same deal with filtering factor here as well. I assume that's just filtering out the input or dampening the input so you don't get jerkiness, but again, not something that they suggest you change. We haven't found the need to change it at all, but it's there should you wish to use it. Then we've got a wide variety of different configurations available for the LED on the front. So we can enable or disable the effects. And that was one thing that I saw a few people mentioned in earlier reviews of this product, is that you couldn't disable the light in the logo if you didn't want to have it on. You can do that now. If you disable the effects here and then hit save and then unplug and replug in the device, that light will be off. So that is good that they've added that functionality. And you can choose between color wipe, theater mode, fading, RGB, animated, and you can see all the various different options here as well. You can also choose a static color, then click on the little color palette. We'll drag that down so you can see it, and a pretty standard Windows style color palette selection here. And then down the bottom here, we do have an adjustment for brightness and the speed in which it cycles through whichever effect you have selected. Now I did notice that even at the minimum brightness level, it is still quite bright. So it doesn't dim all the way down to almost nothing like we have on some other devices, but you do have the option to switch off the LED entirely. Now, one other quick thing to mention with regards to the LED on the device is that it will stay illuminated even when you shut down your PC, provided that there's power coming out of those USB ports. Now, a lot of people run powered hubs on their rigs these days as well. So all the time there's power on the hub, obviously the light is going to stay illuminated. So it would be nice to have a power switch or something like that on the device, which you can turn off just to make sure that it's completely asleep. Then moving across to calibration, this will change depending on whether you have an H-Pattern module or a sequential module attached to the unit. At the moment, you can see H-Pattern selected. And when we move the shifter around, you can see the number corresponding with the gear, which we have selected, is highlighted there. So as far as the software is concerned, it's outputting a different signal depending on which position you're in, and then obviously you calibrate that to match with the corresponding gear in whichever sim title you're driving. Now, another thing that you can do is actually drag these lines around to configure the detection zone. So again, you can imagine if we've got a different plate on here, if we want to create a custom plate for our own specific car that we might be wanting to replicate, then we can adjust those detection zones and calibrate around that so that the gears correspond with the plate which we customize. So I think that's a really cool feature. There's something that we don't see with the Fanatec H-Pattern Shifter, for example. You are limited to exactly how they want you to use it, as opposed to being able to create your own custom plates here. So it does add complexity in the software, and it of course does mean that you have to manually remove and attach different plates. That is going to bother some people, but in terms of versatility, I think this is really great. So we've changed the top plate across to sequential now. So we're going to flick the little switch on the back to tell it that we're in sequential mode. And you can see immediately the software flicks over. So you don't need to disconnect and reconnect the module physically to have that work, which is great. So as you can see now, we've got a 9 and 10 instead of our 1 to 8. Pretty self-explanatory. And again, we can adjust these bars to tweak exactly how this responds. So say for example, if we drag it really small like that, and then hit save to commit that change to the device. Now I only need to move the shifter the tiniest little bit there to correspond with a gear change. So if you want the gear to change really quickly, you can do that. Now obviously you're not going to want to have it this tight, but this is just to sort of demonstrate how this works. And then if we drag it really big, that is going to ensure that we don't hit that threshold until we get to the very, very end of the throw there. So you can see 9 is actually a little bit after the mechanical click there, so I would want to have that a little bit smaller. So where it was by factory is pretty good. I think about there is probably going to be right, and that way it should correspond. There we go, we click and click. Yeah, that's perfect. And I think that covers just about everything you need to know in terms of the software. So at this point, we've been running the shifter in both sequential and H-Pattern modes on the test rig here for a number of months. So we put it through its paces with a variety of different types of driving, different types of cars, different sims, and so forth. So what I wanted to do here is talk about the impressions using the shifter in both sequential and H-Pattern mode, simply because it's easier to kind of describe what I'm feeling when I'm talking about it specifically, rather than while I'm trying to drive and taking in what's going on with the sim and everything. So we will include some driving tests, of course, as well, but let's quickly talk through exactly what I feel when I'm using the shifter, starting off in sequential mode here. Now, there is a little adjustment screw on the side, which we'll talk about more when we get into H-Pattern in just a moment. That does adjust the tension forward and back, but it doesn't have a large impact in sequential mode, simply because the majority of the restriction here is actually coming from the mechanism in the top plate, as we saw earlier on in the video when we were taking a little deeper dive into the hardware. Now, of course, remember, this is running the V2 top plate, which is what they sell as standard now. Those with the earlier V1 model will have quite a significantly different experience. So the little adjustment screw here on the side, if you tighten it up too much, what you'll actually find, I'll just do it quickly now. If I tighten it up too much, the shifter will actually stick in place and not bounce back to the middle. Now, unfortunately, at the tension that I like to run in H-Pattern mode, it is sufficient to make this stick. So you can see as I back this screw off, there we go, it springs back into the center again. And if I wind that all the way back to pretty much 0, it doesn't have a significant impact on the feeling of the shifter, because as I said before, the mechanism in the top plate is what's actually having the majority of the impact there. Now, the reason I mention that is because if you do prefer to run a stiffer H-Pattern and you happen to have your handbrake mounted in a position that blocks that screw, you're gonna have to take the handbrake off every time you switch between sequential and H-Pattern. So it probably won't be an issue for a lot of people. Obviously, it's gonna depend on how you have things mounted, but for me, it was a minor frustration, but it is what it is. So in terms of the feel of the sequential shifter, obviously you have the 2 separate knobs, which we talked about before. I actually prefer to run the cylindrical style for sequential and then run the rounded knob for H-Pattern, but again, that is going to be a personal preference thing. In terms of play in the shaft and things like that, there is a little bit of side-to-side movement there. Obviously, it is designed to spring from side to side by default, and it's actually just the top plate which is restricting its movement from side to side. Now, underneath the mechanism we looked at earlier, if you have a look at the H-Pattern shifter here, we can see there is actually a Delrin insert here, which is this type of hard plastic, and that is similar inside here as well. So it's not metal to metal contact on the sides, and you'll notice there it is relatively quiet when it bashes into the side. So not going to be a problem for anybody, and it does give you a nice soft kind of impact there, as opposed to hard metal to metal contact. So I wouldn't say there's any issue with side to side movement or play there. Less than 1 millimeter total travel, I would say. So yeah, not going to be an issue for anybody. Now, in terms of the sensation of actually shifting gears here, as we saw before, there is an adjustment available on the top plate itself, which determines how much force is required to actuate the lever in either direction. I found the default setting was actually pretty good for me, but I think there's enough range there available that regardless of whether you like it soft or hard, it's going to suit you. And obviously, it's impossible for me to describe exactly what that feels like at every single possible adjustment, because it's an analog thing. But the important things here are that you get a really mechanical sensation in the shifter itself. And that's obviously a combination of the various different elements within the shifter itself, which are mechanically moving. So we saw that kind of lever mechanism earlier on too, which is responsible for creating that sensation of actually mechanically shifting something inside the unit. So what happens is you've got that initial little bit of push, and you can see there's very little play there in the lever at all. And that what play is there does feel like it's spring-loaded. So there's no slop in the shifter at all, really. I mean, it's hard to describe on camera because you guys can see a little bit of movement there, but there is a little bit of resistance behind that. It's not just flapping around entirely. And a good way to demonstrate that is you can see if I move the shifter around just with that little bit of flex that we have in the Trak Racer mount, you can see that the lever itself isn't wobbling around freely. So there's enough resistance there to stop that from moving. And then as we push the shifter in either direction, we get to about 50%, we feel the little clunk as that mechanism latches across, and then we get a little bit more throw there before we hit the hard stop there up against the Delrin plastic internally. Now, one thing that I do really like here is it feels identical in both directions. Some other shifters that we've tested have felt a little bit different depending on which direction you're going, but this has a really nice mechanical clunk in either direction. And I think when you add in that adjustability as well, you're going to be able to dial this in to feel really good. But the thing I really like is that you really do get a sensation of it mechanically connected to something internally and not just activating a switch. So I'd say they've done a really good job there. Now, another thing to just quickly mention here, as you saw earlier, you can adjust the position of the knob on the shaft up and down, as you see here. Now, what we did was measure the amount of throw that we have, or the offset front to rear, at its minimum and maximum setting. We found that the difference in throw between the minimum and maximum was 7 millimeters. So when you pull on it towards you, the actual physical travel is 7 millimeters further towards you or further away from you than it is in the bottom setting. Now, I can tell you that it doesn't have a real strong influence on the overall feeling of the shifter. You may want to add a little bit more resistance or a little bit more tension if you have the longer lever on there, but it's certainly not a massive amount of difference in feeling, meaning that you can just quickly adjust the knob up and down if you want to, and you're not going to need to pull the top plate off to adjust the tension internally either. So what we'll do now is switch this out for the H-Pattern top plate. I'm going to do this live on camera so you guys can see how complex it is and how quickly it can be done with a little bit of experience. So let's do that now. And that took just under 2 minutes, 1 minute 55. So there you go. So again, with the H-Pattern, we of course have the ability to move the knob up and down, and that is gonna have a large influence here on how far you feel the shifter is moving. So you can see here, it's relatively short throw. If we extend that all the way up to the top, so about 2 inches higher than we had it before, you can see now there's quite a lot more movement there, and it does feel a lot more like a slush box than it did lower down. Now, I like to have relatively short throw, so I'm going to put that down to the bottom. But again, that's going to be a personal preference thing. Now, just like we had with the sequential shifter, we do have an adjustment here for the tension required to move the shifter between gears on the Y-axis or forward and backwards. However, we don't have an adjustment for our side-to-side movement or our X-axis. So the spring, and you saw this earlier on when we looked internally, there's a spring here which stipulates the tension moving from side to side. And you can see that does have quite a loose kind of feel to it. So it moves around pretty freely there. So when we adjust the tension on the side here via the little screw from front to back, at the moment, it's relatively soft. If I wind that nice and tight, you can see now it actually requires quite a jolt to move it in each direction. So that's actually stiffer than I would like it. So I'm going to back that off just a touch. And it is quite a sensitive adjustment. We'll back it off to there. Still a little bit too tight. Yeah, about there is good. So now it's a lot stiffer to actually clunk into each gear, but you can see the side-to-side movement is still untouched. So it's still just as loose as it was before. Now, because the side-to-side movement here is relatively loose and undampened, what I found, particularly when I first started driving with this shifter compared to the Fanatec Shifter as well, is first to second is just fine. Going from second to third, what I ended up doing was quite often mis-shifting and going up into fifth gear by accident. And you can see here, even just when I do it, like if I'm looking forward and I go second, third, you really kind of have to ride it up against that gate to get it to go into third gear, because if you just kind of go like that across, it's so loose that it automatically kind of wants to skip past third gear and go up into fifth gear instead. And same deal shifting down from 5th gear into 4th, I found quite often I was finding myself misshifting going down into 2nd instead. Now, in fairness, that is also a similar problem in real life cars if you're driving something that has a gated shifter like this does. I remember when I drove a Ferrari Testarossa, for example, back when I worked at the museum, I had exactly the same problem with that car that I'm having with this shifter now. So it is purely just something that you have to get used to. It's not a defect with the shifter in any way, shape or form, but something that I think is important for you guys to be aware of. And the reason for that is that it is more profound on this shifter than it is in some others. So it would be nice if there was a way to dampen this side-to-side movement, or maybe add a little bit of extra spring tension. Unfortunately, that just isn't something that we can adjust at this point in time. However, just like with the sequential shifter, I feel like there is enough adjustment there in the tension front to back that it really does give you that nice mechanical sensation, regardless of what you're trying to emulate. I think the majority of different cars are going to be covered here. Obviously, the amount of throw is going to vary greatly depending on different types of cars as well. So that's something that obviously you don't have quite so much scope of adjustment over here. But with the knob adjusted as low as it can go here, and with the spring adjusted there, probably about half as tight as it can go. For me, that is pretty much ideal. And again, it gives you that really good sensation of actually mechanically shifting gears into place rather than just activating switches. So overall, I'd say, yeah, good amount of adjustment there and a good mechanical feel. I would just like to see a little bit more spring tension, or maybe some adjustment or extra dampening on that side-to-side movement, just to make it a little bit more, I guess, friendly for jumping into different gears and just giving a little bit more sensation from side to side. So as you know, we've been running this shifter in both H-Pattern and sequential mode on our test rig now for a number of months, really put it through its paces through a variety of different driving styles. So let's run through our pros and cons list now. First thing on my pros list was solid high quality construction throughout, with good design choices in the smaller details such as Delrin bump stops, for example. So just little tiny attention to detail, things like that really stand out with this product. I think when you compare it to the Fanatec Shifter, for example, although that is relatively solid in its construction, a lot of things are quite similar between the two. Just little things like not having metal to metal contact on the bump stops when you shift into each gear. Little things like that really do make a big difference in the context of a sim racing specific product, and those little details are definitely not missed on this product. So thumbs up there. One software package to manage all VNM products is a nice touch. Compatibility was also very good too, so we didn't have any issues with this working in any of the sim titles that we tested it with. Obviously there isn't console compatibility at this point in time, at least not with our aftermarket adapters, which is beyond the scope of today's video. But if you are looking for something that is console compatible, you may need to look elsewhere. But I do really like the idea of having the one software package manage all of their various different products into the future as well. It's a trend that we're starting to see more of now. Fanatec have obviously been doing it for quite some time. We have Fanatec Sim Sports doing a similar thing too. It just means you don't have to download multiple software packages to use multiple different items on your sim rig. And it can get crazy over time. With our daily driver sim rig, for example, we've got about 15 different software packages that we have to open up to make everything work. And obviously that's an extreme example, but the more simple and the more streamlined you can make things, obviously the more enjoyable and less opportunity there is for things to go wrong. Next item gives a good mechanical sensation, like you're actually moving gears around inside the gearbox and not just activating a switch. And what that means in the real world is it gives you a deeper level of immersion when you're driving. You actually feel like you're changing through the gears and you really get lost in that sensation, as opposed to just feeling like you're flicking a switch. So that is the reason why you're spending more money on a shifter like this as opposed to some of the other options that are out there. So ability to add additional top plates for more obscure shift patterns, or even custom build your own and have that all being able to be calibrated through the software, is a really nice touch, something that you don't get with the Fanatec Shifter by comparison. Also on my pros list was the various different mounting options which are available here. So we can mount from the rear, we can mount from the bottom. We also have the optional mounting bracket here to attach our handbrake to the rig. So whichever way you want to mount it, there's a solution that's going to suit. Although the unit is quite tall and that may limit some people, I don't think that you're going to run into too many scenarios where you can't find some sort of solution that will work for you. You may need to use some extra angle brackets and some bits of profile to get the job done. done. But yeah, I don't think you're gonna have too many issues mounting this up regardless of what type of rig you have. And it's great to see that rig manufacturers like Trak Racer, which we have here, are already starting to include mounting solutions directly for this product. So that makes things even easier still. So lastly on my pros list, good range of tension adjustability on the Y-axis, so forward to back movement, and that goes for H-Pattern as well as sequential. Although I would like some tension adjustment on the X-axis or side-to-side movement to improve H-Pattern further. So that kind of segues into our cons list now. First item of which is no adjustment on the X-axis, which does make side-to-side movement feel quite sloppy and takes some getting used to. Although in fairness, it's not dissimilar to a lot of real-life gated H-Pattern cars. So I gave the example before of driving a Ferrari Testarossa, which has that classic Ferrari-style gated H-Pattern on it, and I did have similar problems driving that car to what I had with this. So you do get used to it, but particularly shifting from second to third, I often do find that I accidentally slip across and go into fifth. Shifting from fifth back down to fourth, same thing. I often accidentally shift back down into second and so forth. So again, it may not bother some people, and I do think that it's something that you will get used to, but having a little bit more tension there, or maybe just some adjustability, would make it a bit easier to slip into the right gear every single time without any misshifts. So there is that. So next on the cons list, the gear shift knob does have a tendency to spin, as you can see here. Now I do like the fact that it is adjustable up and down, but I found, at least with my level of strength, tightening that as much as I possibly can without gloves on, the knob still does have a tendency to spin around side to side. It doesn't slip up and down, thankfully, but I don't like the sensation of that knob being able to move in my hand. Now, I believe the earlier models of this did actually utilize a grub screw in the side to fix it in position. Now, that has the disadvantage of marking the shaft. So if you are frequently adjusting the height, you can end up with a scratched up shaft, a little dents in the shaft, which isn't ideal either. So it's going to be a trade-off either way. It may not bother some people, but it is something that's there. So it's definitely something that you need to be aware of. And it does tend to bother me when I'm driving, because I have a tendency to kind of fidget with it while I'm driving along. So be aware of that. Next up on the list, firmware update process is quite clunky. This was something that we mentioned with the handbrake review as well. You have to kind of manually put it into a DFU mode or flash mode with a little button on the back there. And it is quite a kind of bootleg style process, I guess you could call it. So you're having to download a separate software package to update the firmware. You're having to make sure that you've got the right checkboxes selected. I think the thing that I don't like about it the most is the fact that you actually have to erase the firmware before flashing the new package. So if something goes wrong there, theoretically the bootloader should still be good, so you should still be able to do a good flash. But I do feel like that's an overwhelming process for people that aren't necessarily tech savvy. Even for me, as somebody who's flashed thousands of firmware packages over the years, it did make me a little bit more nervous than something that's just a click the button and it does the update, and it's as simple as that. So something to be aware of. I mean, you're not going to be updating the firmware often with this, so I don't think it's a major detractor. But again, it is worth mentioning because it is something that may put some people off. So while we're on the subject of software, although I did mention earlier that I do like the fact that it's all an integrated package, so all of their hardware works with the same software package, I do think the software is quite overwhelming for the less tech savvy users and presents you with a lot of information that may be superfluous to some users. So I would like to see them have some sort of a simple mode there that just gives you the stuff that you need without all that extra system logs and information that you can't really do much with anyway. Some people are going to love that. For me, I felt like it was a little bit more than was necessary. So then lastly on my cons list, and I think this is probably going to be the catch for the majority of people, switching between H-Pattern and sequential modes isn't as easy as it is with the Fanatec Shifter and isn't likely to be something that people are going to want to do frequently. However, having said that, the Shifter does do a better job, in my opinion at least, and remember this is a very subjective thing, than the Fanatec Shifter does in both H-Pattern and particularly in sequential mode. I really do feel like this is leagues above the Fanatec Shifter when it comes to sequential shifting, simply because you get that really solid sensation of actually mechanically moving gears around inside the shifter, whereas with the Fanatec Shifter in sequential mode, that feels a lot more just like activating a switch than this does. H-Pattern is a lot closer, but I do still feel like this has the slight edge over the Fanatec Shifter. But really, it's just going to boil down to how often you're switching between driving styles. With the Fanatec Shifter, you know, if you're driving a sequential car and then you quickly go, oh, I've got another 20 minutes to drive, I might just quickly jump in something that has an H-Pattern. You're more likely to do that with the Fanatec Shifter, and that's something that I did genuinely find I was doing often. Whereas with this, because you've got to go find your Allen key set, it's, you know, a couple of minutes to pull it apart and swap the top over. You've got the risk of dropping a screw down inside potentially as well, which would mean you'd have to pull the whole thing off the rig and shake it upside down to get it out. All those little things add together to make you kind of go, well, oh, can I really be bothered changing cars? Oh, nah. and it just ends up going in the too hard basket. So again, that threshold is going to be different for different people, but I do feel like if you are switching between cars regularly, you know, if it's something that you're going to be doing every single time you're driving the rig, then the Fanatec Shifter probably is the better option for you, simply because of its ease of use and accessibility. But then you have the trade-off of this, subjectively at least, doing a better job of both those tasks when you actually take the time to manually switch it out. So I think really it's not a case of one product being better than the other. I wish it were that black and white, but I think this is going to do a better job of both things when it comes to the mechanical feel of shifting gears. But the Fanatec Shifter is a lot more convenient when it comes to accessibility. And of course, you do have the added bonus of console compatibility there too. So for me, given that I don't run H-Pattern often, I would sooner put this on my rig than the Fanatec Shifter. But again, I think if I was switching all the time, then I would probably prefer the Fanatec Shifter over this, simply just down to the ease of use. So I really hope that today's video has helped you make up your mind. If you do decide you want to pick up one of these or any of the other products that we've discussed in today's video, we've got some links down in the description below. Those are a great way of helping support our work here at Boosted Media at no additional cost to you. So we really do appreciate your support there. But above all, as always, I really hope that this video has helped you guys out. If it has, please do leave a thumbs up. Make sure you're subbed as well so you don't miss future videos. Next video, we're going to be checking out the VNM handbrake, so stay tuned for that one. But thanks very much for watching, guys, and we'll see you again soon. Bye.